Hello and welcome. My name is Cassandra Matheson and I'm part of ASPCC Student Leadership here at Cascade. As you may know, ASPCC Cascade takes pride in bringing events that not only celebrate our diverse campus culture, but also events that facilitate thought and dialogue surrounding some difficult but necessary conversations that may be taking place in our local communities. Tonight, ASPCC Cascade and our Multicultural Awareness Council are honored to sponsor our speaker, who's among the nation's most prominent anti-racist educators. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you tonight to our keynote speaker, critically acclaimed anti-racism author and activist, Tim Wise.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have to say I'm really impressed with the turnout for both the earlier event and for this one. I understand that there were not only, obviously there wasn't only a full house in here earlier today, but the overflow room was also sort of standing room only. So I'm going to assume either that there is an intense amount of interest in these issues of racial injustice, inequity, privilege, disparity, discrimination here at PCC, which I think may very well be the case, and I'm certainly hoping. Or else, extra credit still counts for a whole lot in higher ed, and all the professors who cajoled your classes or threatened or academically bribed them, you should be given some kind of a prize for having done so, so I appreciate you doing that. To me, it doesn't really matter whether you came out of personal interest or even obsession with these issues or whether you came for academic credit and for academic purposes, because either way, you're here, and I'm here, and we have a little bit of time together, and the lights are, bright enough to where if you were to get up to leave, I would probably notice, and it's tacky, so I'll probably call it out, and we wouldn't want that, so you might just want to stay put, like even if you totally hate this, you should probably just stay in your seat for the sake of not being humiliated is all I'm saying. I'm just saying, stay put. It's only going to be like an hour of your life. You'll never get it back, but it'll be all right, It is good to be here and to be back after what I think, I said earlier it was 2008, but I think I might have been here once since then, maybe in 2010. I'm not 100% sure. I know that I was here in 2008, right before the presidential election. And, I guess like most people, I was just, totally convinced that, after the presidential election, we wouldn't have to have these conversations about racism anymore. But surprise, it didn't really work out that way. I'm sure you're all shocked by that, as I am. I was thoroughly expecting to go in a totally different career direction after the election of a man of color, because we all know that the election of a man of color in a country founded on racism and white supremacy does, by definition, signify the death of white supremacy. I'm sure you all know that, just like you know that the election of a woman as head of state in Pakistan, Israel, India, Great Britain, the Philippines, and Ireland means that patriarchy and misogyny have been utterly eradicated from those nations forever, and that women there now have fully equal opportunity with their male counterparts. Did you not get that memo? I suggest that maybe you didn't, but that would be the logical corollary of what a lot of people would have us believe in this country. So I guess what we're learning, if nothing else, since 2008, is that all fantasies of post-raciality aside, we still have quite a bit of work to do, and it's important to understand just how much work we have left to finish here in this country when it comes to issues of racial equity. And it's important for us to talk about that right now because we're in this sort of strange historical moment. And by that, I'm referring to the fact that, this year, as you know, is sort of a commemorative year. We've been in a commemorative mode with regard to race for a couple of years now for obvious historical reasons, right? This is the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, as you may well know, particularly if you've seen the film Selma. If you haven't, you should see it. It's a fabulous film. But in any event, the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, the 50th anniversary, therefore, of the Voting Rights Act, which came shortly after that. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. The year before that was the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington, the murder of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi, George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama pledging segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So the last couple of years have been years in which we have been able, and we have been very quick, I think, as a country, to look back in time and to talk about these monumentous events. And by the way, I'm not saying that these events are not, these incredible momentous things are not important. We should commemorate them. I mean, I think that's valuable. Commemoration serves a purpose. Remembering serves a purpose. And an awful lot of people fought and died to get us where we are today, so we have to recall what they did and why. However, having said that, I think that we can also agree, at least I hope we can, that sometimes when we are locked in commemoration mode, right, we end up freezing ourselves in time with a constant glance that looks backward at all of the ground that we have covered as a nation, not looking ahead at all the ground that remains to be covered. We look back and we say almost by definition, look how far we've come. My God, isn't that amazing? You know, it's sort of how we teach history in this country, particularly in high school, middle school, right? Unless you had a really incredible history teacher and went to a really quite spectacular school, the odds are you, like me, you know, we were all taught history in a very linear kind of way, right? Which is to say, oh, once upon a time there was this thing called slavery, but some really good people got together and got rid of it. Thank God for that. And then there was this thing called segregation, but then some really good people got together and got rid of that too. And we're always making progress. We're always moving onward and upward and forward in a linear progression so that things were bad, now they're better, tomorrow they'll be even better, as if it was just the turning of the hands on the clock or the changing of the pages on a calendar that made that true, as opposed to the committed acts of advocates and activists and people willing to risk their lives. So when we're in commemoration mode, sometimes we're so focused on the ground that we've covered that we ignore how much remains. It's sort of like going on a road trip from the tip of Maine to San Diego, right? If you were to do that as a child with your parents, right, your parents, by the time they got to Kansas, they'd be like, wow, can you believe how far we've come? And if you're the kid in the back seat, you're like, yeah, but are we there yet? And when the hell are we going to get to San Diego? You're not really impressed with how far you've come because young people are not impressed with retrospective. Young people are not really impressed with commemoration. Young people have too much living to do and too much on the line to talk about how bad things used to be in relation to now. They want to know when are they going to be better in relation to now, because that's the thing about youth. Youth is impatient, and thank God for that. It was young people impatient enough to lead that work in the 1960s when older folk were willing to sit back and look back and say how much better things were than they were in the 30s, you see. Older folk are always willing to do commemoration. I say that as somebody who's older myself. It's real easy for us because we can pat ourselves on the back and talk about how much we've done, but young folk don't care. And right now, these young folk who are leading this post-Ferguson movement, this Black Lives Matter movement, trying to raise attention to the racist over-policing and militarization of police in black and brown space, are doing us all an incredible favor by reminding us that even as we can enjoy a film like Selma for what it says both artistically and historically, we have got work to do. And we can't get trapped in this mode of hero worship of those who have been gone now for a very long time, even as we respect them and even as we guard their memory and guard their legacy, unless we connect to that legacy. Unless we decide to move that legacy forward to that next level, then all we're doing is remembering, and we're not really involved in the work. And it's especially important for us, I would suggest, to think about that civil rights movement that we remember now, 50 years later, roughly, since the height of that movement and the Selma to Montgomery March. It is perfectly appropriate for us to remember that the one arena of American life that went largely untouched by that movement was the one that we're here to talk about tonight. All right? So the civil rights movement focused its attention, and, you know, understandably so. I'm not saying this as a criticism. I'm just saying it as an observation. Understandably so, on segregation in education, discrimination in the job market, discrimination in public accommodations, in voting, and in housing. Those were the primary arenas in which the movement did its work and about which it spoke. Criminal justice and reforming the police were, although certainly talked about and certainly instrumental and key to the political agenda of Black Power movements in the late 1960s, they were largely absent from the advocacy-based, public policy-based aspect of the civil rights struggle in the early 60s that we commemorate now, a half a century later. And having not really talked about that, having not really focused their attention on that, it ought not surprise us that a half century later we haven't made nearly as much progress in that area, and in fact perhaps have gone backwards relative to a few others where, although the gaps have closed far too slowly, they have closed at least a bit. You know, we certainly have seen progress in certain areas, but in this area, virtually none. In fact, regress. In 1964, for instance, 2 out of 3 people locked up in this country were white, and only 1/3 were people of color. By 1994, those numbers had flipped, And by then, and still today, 2/3 of all people incarcerated in this country are people of color, and only 1/3 are white. This is not because white people in 1965 woke up from a deep criminal slumber and said to ourselves, oh my God, we've been committing all this crime. We should probably stop. Don't you think? Like, we should stop that. It's awful. And then black folks, I suppose, according to this theory, looked around and saw that white folks were retiring from crime and said, well, now hell, if they're not going to do it, maybe we should just do it. Somebody's got to do crime. That's not what happened, right? The share of crime committed by black folk as a share of overall crime did not statistically significantly budge in that period. The share of crime done by white folk in that period did not statistically significantly budge, but where we put our criminal justice resources did. And so we begin to see that shift in the immediate aftermath of the passage of this great civil rights legislation, suggesting that this is one arena left largely untouched and thereby allowed to backslide, to get actually worse rather than better. And what's ironic about that is that the criminal justice system was largely ignored by the dominant strand of the civil rights struggle, even as law enforcement has been always and forever a central fulcrum of racism in the United States, a central key lever of white supremacy. So that, for instance, even by the 1930s, half of all African Americans who were killed by whites in those days were killed by white law enforcement, and the other half were almost always killed with the collaboration and the silence and the participation indirectly of law enforcement. In 1917, the worst of all race riots possibly in this country's history took place. There were race riots every year in the first 30 to 40 years of the 20th century, but in 1917, one in particular in which law enforcement actively participated in East St. Louis, Illinois, not all that far from Ferguson, Missouri, on the other side of the river. In that particular riot, 150 individuals were killed, African American folks killed, 35 children killed, their bodies thrown into bonfires, their skulls crushed against rocks by police and civilians who acted under the cover of police. And so these kinds of stories, whether we're talking about the way in which cops actively participated in the murder of black people or sat back and watched as other white, quote-unquote, civilians did so in these race riots, it is important for us to acknowledge those things, because that history suggests to us that the history of law enforcement and the history of white supremacy are very much entwined, not only in those two instances, but if you think about all of the ways in which white supremacy historically has been maintained. Slave patrols, that was law enforcement. Black codes, that was law enforcement. Segregation enforced by law enforcement. Fugitive slave laws, that was law enforcement. The killing of 27 members of the Black Panther Party by police, including but not limited to Mark Clark and Fred Hampton in their beds while they slept in Chicago. Law enforcement, the bombing of the row houses in which MOVE family and organizational members lived in Philadelphia in 1985, in which about a dozen individuals, including half a dozen children, were killed. Law enforcement, that history about which we're often not taught, shapes the way in which people of color come to understand law enforcement in America, and it shapes, therefore, the way that they understand things like the killing of Mike Brown, like the killing of Eric Garner, like the killing of Tamir Rice, like the killing of Amadou Diallo, like the killing of Rekia Boyd, like the killing of Katherine Johnston, like the killing of one after another man and or woman of color, disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. Those to black and brown people cannot be seen as isolated incidents because they take place against a backdrop of decades and generations and centuries of law enforcement abuse against black and brown bodies. So while we as white folks often look at these things as individual, and we assume that we have to assess them all as individual, isolated cases, it is impossible for a community that has felt and has been targeted by this institution to view them in that particular way, especially when today we know that every week there are 2 black men and or women who are being killed unarmed by law enforcement or wannabe law enforcement, people like George Zimmerman. Right? Speaking of whom, for those who believed George Zimmerman's version of what happened that night, when he came upon Trayvon Martin, you might want to reflect on what it means that this individual who supposedly insisted to us that Trayvon was the violent one, Trayvon was the aggressor, Trayvon was the one who was dangerous. This individual, very much unlike Trayvon, who did not have a record of assault and battery, did not have a violent criminal history, this individual, since getting out of jail, has now been arrested 3 times for domestic battery, 3 times for violent and unhinged actions. But we believed him as a country. So many white folks did, according to the surveys, because it is easier, is it not, to believe that Trayvon Martin is a dangerous individual than to believe that George Zimmerman may have been acting on the basis of his own internalized biases against black males. So just keep that in mind. 2 a week. And black males 21 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement than white males. It is not because they are 21 times more likely to commit crime. That is certainly not the case. It is not because they are 21 times more likely to act aggressively toward police. In fact, what evidence we have suggests either that there is no difference in the aggressiveness that is exhibited by white males versus black males when they encounter police, or that if anything, black males are less likely to be aggressive toward police when confronted by them because they know full well that if they do, they will die. They will cease to be carbon-based life forms. And yet they are still 21 times more likely to be killed in spite of that fact. So black folks and brown folk can't ignore this the way that some of us in the white community have been able to do. They have to think about this as a pattern. And once you have enough so-called isolated incidents, it becomes a pattern. It becomes a social problem. It tells you something about your culture. The biggest problem here, though, is that white America, by and large, with exceptions duly noted, so if I'm not speaking in a way that applies to you, you don't have to get defensive, Buttercup. White America, by and large, does not see this thing about which I speak. They do not know of this history that I just recited to you in short form version. They do not appreciate the depth of that history. And how do I know that? Well, because I'm paying very close attention to what so many white folks say every time one of these instances happens, and they happen with alarming regularity, as you know, as of late. Every time that an officer in this country kills an unarmed black male, the first thing that it seems so many white Americans default to is to ask the following question. Well, what did he do to provoke them? I want you to think for a minute about what that question suggests. We only ask this question of individuals who are marginalized and oppressed when they are injured. We want to know what they did. We do this with black folks when they're killed by cops. We do this with women as women when they're the victims of sexual assault. We do this with our LGBT brothers and sisters when they're bashed on the streets. Whenever you're a member of a marginalized group and something happens to you, we want to know what you did. If you're a member of a dominant group, we don't ask that question. We just assume something horrible must have happened in most cases. But when it's someone who's black, we say, what did they do to provoke the police? I don't know. What did Amadou Diallo do? Except be black. Because when he was set upon by the New York Police Department Street Crimes Unit in 1999, all he did was reach for his keys and his wallet because he was trying to get into his own apartment in the vestibule of his own home in New York City. The cops rolled up on him, jumped out of the car, didn't identify themselves as police, didn't have police uniforms on, drew their guns, pointed them at him. He was horrified. He was scared. He was trying to put his hands up, trying to get his wallet out. I guess maybe thinking he was going to be robbed. So here, take my wallet. No, we'll just shoot you 41 times instead. How about that? But we won't go to jail for it. What did Amadou Diallo do? Nothing except be black. What did Eric Garner do to justify being strangled on the streets of Staten Island? Well, according to the story, he was selling loose cigarettes on the street. 2 important points. Number 1, no loose cigarettes were found on his body when they took him to the morgue. So he must have had a real good day selling all those cigarettes because he didn't have any left. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, selling loose cigarettes, last time I checked, even on Staten Island is not an offense that is punishable by death. So there might be folks on Staten Island who wish that it was, because that's sort of the way that that particular borough rolls. So here's a guy, all he did was be black, and then he mouthed off to cops, which, by the way, is not illegal. It may not be advisable. I don't advise you to do it, and I especially don't advise you to do it if you're black. I'm just saying, don't do it. Probably not a good move. But It is not against the law. And so when he told them, this stops today, y'all always harassing me, this stops today, enough of this, I'm tired of it, that was enough for this particular officer to say, no, to hell with it. You're not tired of it, and we're not stopping today. I'm going to put my arm around your throat. I'm going to compress your jugular vein so that the blood that has made it to your head can't leave your head, can't continue to circulate throughout your body, and you will now die. And he, too, not indicted. What did Eric Garner do to justify that? To bring about that action? Absolutely nothing at all. You can watch the video yourself, although apparently video footage doesn't mean anything to grand juries in Staten Island who cannot see what the rest of us can with our own eyes. What did Tamir Rice in Cleveland do? 12-year-old child. Shot dead by a police department which has been critiqued by the Justice Department as one of the most corrupt, brutal, violent, and incompetent when it comes to these particular kind of cases, police departments in the United States. Unbelievable, the level of depravity in this particular department. But here in this case, you have a 12-year-old child playing with a toy gun in a park. And somebody calls the police and says, there's this guy playing with a gun. I think it's probably a toy. No big deal. And he looks like a juvenile. No big deal. But just wanted to give you a heads up. Maybe you drive around and see. So the caller wasn't even that freaked out about it. Caller wasn't, that exorcised about it. He wasn't that concerned that this was a real gun, right? But the dispatcher didn't tell the officers that they thought it was a toy or that it was a kid. So the officers roll up. Now, their first version of the story, and you can watch the video on this too, if you have the stomach for it. They said, well, we told him to drop his weapon 3 times. And then he took it out of his waistband and pointed it at us. So we had no choice but to shoot him because we thought the gun was real. And we told him, and he didn't follow orders. He didn't respect authority, except now, see, they didn't know there was a video. Oh, sorry. So you can watch the tape, and you see the car pull up. And in less than 2 seconds, Tamir Rice has been shot and is bleeding out on the ground. They didn't ask him 3 times to drop his weapon. They didn't have time to do that. They likely didn't ask him even once. They got out and they shot him. And by the way, he didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't pull his weapon. Hell, he didn't reach for his toy. He didn't pull his toy, and he didn't point his toy at any cop. But the cop that dropped him, who a year and a half earlier had been found mentally unstable to be a police officer, but they let him be one anyway. They certainly didn't care, did they? Didn't care that he was mentally incompetent, didn't care that he was unstable, didn't care that he had failed one after another test in a previous police department, right, and had been let go from that department for that reason. So they killed Tamir Rice. He's bleeding out. His sister runs toward him to try to offer some comfort to her brother. They take her and throw her in the back of a police car, won't let her see him. This is what criminal justice looks like in 2015 in this country. And we'll see whether or not that officer is indicted, but I'll tell you what, if he isn't, the city of Cleveland had damn well better be made ungovernable by protest. That's what it will deserve, and that's what it will richly receive if those young folks leading this struggle have anything to say about it, and if those of us in this room who care enough have anything to say about it. So Tamir Rice didn't do anything but be black, playing with a toy gun, something that, hell, white men run around with real guns in the state of Ohio, because it's an open carry state, y'all. So it's legal. You can walk around with a damn assault rifle on your shoulder. As long as you're white, they won't mess with you. You don't believe me? When you get back to your place tonight, Google the terms white men, guns, and Target. I don't mean like Target practice. I mean like Target the store. Because apparently white guys can't go to Target in Ohio without a damn gun on their shoulder. I got to get some toilet paper at Target. Better take my AK. And they walk around just to show that they have Second Amendment rights to display their guns wherever they want. But apparently, if you have a toy gun and you're black, you don't have that right. And they don't just go to Target, then they go over to Chipotle with their gun. Google that. Chipotle with a gun. What you need a gun at Chipotle for? You mad they don't have carnitas right now? Is that your problem? You mad? Right? Then they're rolling up in church with the gun. Because they're just trying to make sure everybody knows they're keeping it safe with the gun so white men can walk around with actual loaded weapons. They don't get shot. You can play with a toy gun, be black, get shot. Don't tell me that's not about race. What in the world did John Crawford do outside of Akron last year? Well, he went to Walmart, and as he was walking around talking to his girlfriend, he picked up an air rifle, which is not exactly a deadly weapon. It's an air rifle, which, by the way, they sell at Walmart. They actually sell real guns at Walmart too, but this was an air rifle. He picked it up off the shelf. He's walking around with it. All right, just walking around, sort of swinging it, sort of leaning on it. I don't know, maybe he was going to buy it, maybe not, who knows. Maybe he just found it interesting. So he picked it up, and then somebody, white guy in Walmart, saw him and got scared. Oh, black man, gun, ooh, dangerous. Calls the police, says, there's a black man at the Walmart. He has an afro. No, actually, it was twist, so let's get your black hair straight. Let's get your black hair straight, please. See, if white folks can't even be trusted to get their black hair straight, they definitely can't be trusted to determine who's dangerous and who's not. Afro, what the hell, where you been? Black guy with an afro, he's going to get somebody shot that's not even John Crawford if he keeps that up, right? Some other guy with an afro is like, what? I didn't even, the hell? So he says, black guy with an afro pointing a weapon at children, threatening people. See, but dude didn't know there was a video. Once again, see, they need to pay more attention. There's video now, right? So you go to the tape, which you can watch, once again, if you have the stomach for it. And what's actually happening? Nothing. He's not pointing the weapon at anybody. He's not threatening anybody. For most of the time, there's not even anybody close to him in the store that he could have been threatening. And the few people that do walk around him don't seem scared. They just picking stuff off the shelf. Oh, yeah, black guy with a toy gun. Cool, no big deal. Nobody's worried about it except this one guy who flaked out, called the cops. Now the cops roll up. They also say, oh, we warned him to drop his gun and he wouldn't do it. And then he pointed it at us and then we had to shoot him. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. The video makes it clear. He didn't have time to point. He didn't even know what was happening. They roll into the aisle. They shoot him. He drops. He gets back up, stunned, not knowing what's happening. He does not have the gun in his hands, let alone pointing it at anyone. It's 4 feet from him. He stands back up. He moves back out into the aisle to wonder what's going on. The officer drops him and kills him in a hail of bullets. What did John Crawford do except be black? And the individual who killed him is the only officer in the history of that suburban Akron police department ever to have killed someone in the line of duty. And he has now killed 2 in the line of duty. The only one in the whole history of the department to have done that. Now he's got 2 kills under his belt. I'm sure that is a coincidence. And he too was not indicted. Because apparently, if you're John Crawford, if you're Tamir Rice, if you're Eric Garner, if you're Amadou Diallo, or any of these individuals, your rights do not extend the way that others do. Frankly, what did Mike Brown do? See, I know we think we know, don't we? Because we've heard all this nonsense that we've been fed, right? So there are these surveys that have been taken. White folks are pretty sure that Darren Wilson had no choice, had to shoot Mike Brown. I'm not saying that's true of all the white folks in this room, but I'm just saying what the survey data says. Right? White folks really, by and large, sided with Darren Wilson on that thing. Some of them sided with him so much they raised $500,000 for his defense, which now he doesn't even need because the grand jury didn't indict, but I bet he doesn't give the money back. Right? And nor does he have to legally. He gets to keep $500,000 for killing a black child in the United States of America. Right? That's the only growth industry in the United States right about now. Right? $500,000 by people that said, and they wrote things like, thank you for taking out the garbage. Now let's talk about what Mike Brown did and didn't do. Or let's talk about what we think he did according to those who claim he charged the officer. Right? One individual, one witness in that case testified in the grand jury proceedings that Mike Brown charged Darren Wilson like a bull at full speed as a way to justify his shooting by Officer Wilson. Now we know, however, or maybe you didn't get this memo because it didn't receive nearly as much national media attention as the original case, that the individual who claimed that actually wasn't even there. She lied. This is someone who was so racist that the day after the case, she started putting racist posts on her Facebook page defending Darren Wilson, calling the entire community of Ferguson in everything but, a place where children of God dwell. I mean, it was essentially nothing but racism, one after the other comment about Mike Brown being a thug. So all of a sudden, she decides maybe to sweeten the deal, make sure Darren Wilson walks. She's going to lie and say she was there. She fabricated it. She wasn't there. She wasn't on the scene. She's the only one who said that Mike Brown charged Darren Wilson like a bull. Oh, and by the way, the prosecutor who put her on the stand in the grand jury proceeding knew she was lying. He's now admitted that. He admitted that he knew her testimony was false. He knew she was not there, but let her testify anyway. That is suborning perjury. That is a criminal offense. That is something for which someone should lose their law license and be incarcerated for a substantial period of time as a member of the public or as someone who's supposed to enforce the public trust as a head law enforcement official in that community. But of course, he won't do time. He won't lose his license. Nothing's going to happen to him. So the grand jury doesn't return an indictment because they believe Mike Brown charged Darren Wilson. Let us ask a question for just a second about that claim, can we? Because again, it gets to the heart of why it is that white America is so quick to believe the claims of this cop who said that he was charged by Mike Brown, because he said that too. The cop said it, and this lying racist said it. Right? Virtually no one else made a claim even remotely like that. 16 out of 29 witnesses said that he was in the process of raising his hands to surrender. Now, that doesn't mean that that's true. That's why we're supposed to have trials in this country, though, isn't it? So we can get to the truth. That's why you get an indictment and you go to trial, and then you put all the witnesses up and you cross-examine them, and then the jury makes a decision. But we don't even get to have that work because they've decided it isn't even worth going to trial. When you've got 16 witnesses who tell you that a crime was essentially committed and you can't get an indictment, there's something wrong, right? So Darren Wilson claims, oh, he charged me. Let's ask why that was so believable in this country, because that goes to that piece up there about white denial, right? Think about what it says, that white Americans, so many, not all, again, maybe not even a majority, but from what I've seen, probably a majority, believe the claim that Mike Brown charged Darren Wilson, and therefore Darren Wilson had no choice but to shoot. Can you just ask yourself, why anyone would buy that story? Because let's just take the story at face value for a second, right? Let's just look at the story in the light most favorable to Darren Wilson. So what is that light? Darren Wilson says Mike Brown punched him through the window, right? And unprovoked, just decided to just hit him. Find that hard to believe, that a black guy is just going to take a shot at a cop, right? Seems a cop who has a gun. A cop who has a gun just going to punch him through the window. I find it unlikely, but hey, for the sake of argument, let's just say, yep, that's what happened. Mike Brown punched him through the window, right? And then we know Darren Wilson, according to his testimony, scared for his life now, tries to get his gun out, and it goes off, discharges whatever, shoots Mike Brown in the hand. So now Michael Brown has been shot, which means at least two things are true. Mike Brown knows that the cop does have a gun, and secondly, that the cop is willing to use it. He now knows this for a fact because he's been shot. So then Mike Brown rationally turns around and starts to run, because that's a good move. Like when you're being shot and you're afraid, you might flee. That's sort of the logical thing. So he turns around and he starts to run away, and he gets like 35 yards away. And all of a sudden, to believe Darren Wilson's story, you have to think that Mike Brown, after trying to get away from the cop with the deadly weapon who has shown that he's willing to use it against your life, decides, screw it. I think I'm just going to turn around and run through a hail of bullets, because the laws of physics do not apply to my body. I'm sure those bullets will just bounce off of me like rubber. Right? And I'm sure that at 300 pounds, I can easily traverse this 35 yards in like a millisecond so that I will get to the cop before his bullets get to me. Does anyone actually believe that that makes any sense? That someone who was rational enough to try to run away from an officer with a gun would then decide to charge him from 35 yards down the block and try to knock him down, somehow believing that he wouldn't shoot him again? See, it seems to me that is fundamentally illogical, irrational. You cannot possibly believe that that makes sense, and yet the grand jury apparently did, and millions of Americans apparently do, because they still want to act as if Mike Brown did something other than be black and other than potentially smart off at Darren Wilson, when Darren Wilson rudely told he and his friend to get up on the curb and not walk in the middle of the street. All of these cases involve individuals whose actions were far less aggressive toward police than the actions of several white folks in the last several months who haven't been shot. See, this is how we know it's about race. This is how we know that it's about institutional white supremacy and white privilege, because in the very same year that all of those cases happened, or at least several of them that happened in the last year, there were at least a dozen, I'll mention a few of them, a dozen cases where white folks with weapons pointed at cops, acted in a very aggressive way, and were not shot, were not beaten, were not clubbed over the head with a baton, had not a bruise or scratch on them, were taken without incident and arrested and are still living. So in Michigan last year, outside of a Dairy Queen, there was a white man with a loaded rifle standing outside of the Dairy Queen, pointing the rifle at people, threatening cops, telling the cops that if he wanted to, he could threaten their children and their families. Then he announced that revolution was coming. Right? The cops told him, drop your weapon, asked him several times to give ID. He cussed them and said he wasn't going to give them ID, didn't have to give them ID, and if he wanted to threaten their families, he could, once again, pointing the weapon all over the place. They took him without incident, without injury, without killing him, had him sleep it off in the drunk tank, and gave him back his gun the next morning. In San Diego, white man at a public park pulls out a 9mm gun, points it at cops and children in that park. At one point, he rushes toward the officers with the 9 pointed at them and a police helicopter overhead. One of the officers does shoot him because, he's charging him with the gun pointed. That sort of makes sense. Like, I get it. Shoots him, but doesn't kill him. Shoots him in the stomach. He falls down. He's in great amount of pain. The gun is sort of lying a few feet from him. Now the cops have a choice. They could shoot him again. They could go in and rush him and beat him, which is, what they do in a lot of these cases. I'm not saying they should have. I'm just saying they could have done that. They didn't do any of that for this white guy that they've just shot. You know what they did? They called him on the cell phone because he had a cell phone in his pocket. They're like, pick up. He's like, oh, what? We'd really like for you to give yourself up now. He's like, okay, right? So they take him, again, alive. They do not kill him. They do not continue to brutalize him. In New Hampshire, white man fires a BB gun at police, right? They do not shoot him. They do not beat him. They take him without incident or injury. Now, I'm not naive. I know that a BB gun can't kill you, but now, like my mama said, it'll put your eye out, right? So it's still dangerous, and I have a feeling if it's a black man or a Latino male shooting a BB gun at cops, it might go down a little bit differently. I can't prove it, but I have a fleeting suspicion. Right? Outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, about 6 weeks ago, not even that, a month ago, white woman driving around the neighborhood in this suburb outside of Chattanooga, shooting at everything, shooting at her neighbors, shooting at the mailbox, shooting at animals, takes the cops on a 70-mile-an-hour chase, starts shooting at them. They take her without incident, without injury. They don't kill her. Best example, New Orleans last April. White male armed robbery suspect cornered by 3 officers, points a weapon at the officers. The officers point their weapons at him. They say to the white man with the gun pointed at them, "Sir, drop your weapon." Okay, lesson number 1 in white privilege. If you don't know what white privilege is, write that shit down that I just said, because I'm going to tell you right now, if you point a weapon at an officer and they ask you to drop your weapon, I know one thing about you. I know you are white. Because otherwise they would have just shot him and they'd have said, you really should have dropped your weapon. As he lays there dying on the ground, that's what would have happened. But he points his weapon, they say, "Sir, please drop your weapon." And not only does he not please drop his weapon, he proceeds to look at the officers, his gun still pointed at them, and what does he say? He says, "No, you drop your effing gun." Oh, for real? You drop your effing gun? And the cops do not shoot him. Do not shoot him. Do not beat him. Do not club him, kick him, tase him. Do not pepper spray him. Do not do anything. You know what they do? They say, "No, really, you. Drop your weapon." And he's like, "No, you. No, you. No, really, you go first." No, it's like an Abbott and Costello routine. It's like bad sketch comedy. Nobody wants to drop their weapon. Finally, they take him without injury. They do not shoot him. They do not kill him. Case after case after case. So this idea of what did they do to provoke the police, why can't they just obey authority, has no weight. Because there are white folks not obeying authority all the time, living to tell the story, and black folks posing far less threat who do not have the luxury of saying that. But it's not just with regard to police brutalization and hyper-policing and militarized policing when it comes to actually shooting individuals. It's also just the day-to-day work of the justice system and law enforcement. Like with stop and frisk in New York City, which now technically has been ended, and it has, certainly dropped off from where it was a few years ago, for sure. But we know during that time, people were so quick to rationalize it, weren't they? Over a 5-year period that was under review by the courts, there were 2.5 million individuals stopped under the stop and frisk policy in New York City, 88% of them folks of color, and less than 5% of the cases where people were stopped were they even given a ticket, let alone arrested for something, which is to say that in at least 95% of all the cases, those individuals had not committed a crime. This isn't a particularly strong law enforcement tactic. If you're wrong 95% or more of the time, how can that be considered good law enforcement? When it came to getting drugs off the street, which was one of the rationales they offered, less than 2% of the time did they find drugs. Less than 0.2% of the time Did they find weapons? And yet the former mayor and former chief of police tried to use that as the rationale, right? That was their argument. They said this is a good way to get guns off the street. Less than 0.2% of the time you found a weapon. How is that a good anti-gun strategy? I would do better just walking down Broadway in Times Square and just tapping people on the shoulder. Hey, you got a gun? Yeah, I got one right here. You know, I could probably get 0.3% just randomly. They got 0.2%. They're supposed to be professionals, right? I'm an amateur gun finder. I could have done better than that, right? So this was never about crime. It wasn't about drugs. It wasn't about guns. It was about people control. It was about controlling individuals, getting their name into the system. Because, you know, every time they had one of those folks that came up innocent, 95% of the time didn't even get a citation. They put their name in the system, though, right? They put their name in the system, so now they've got them on file. So it's about control. It's about surveillance. It's about keeping your eyes on people who you expect the worst from. If not today, definitely tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, definitely next week. And if not next week, I bet next year. So we just want to make sure we got them in the system up front as a preventative tactic. But we don't do that in white communities, even when perhaps we should. I mean, the war on drugs is what was used to rationalize so much of that misbehavior, not only in places like New York, but all over the country. And yet, what does the data tell us? The data tells us that even though black and Latino folk are 2 to 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, white folks on the occasions when we're searched are 3 to 4 times more likely to have the stuff on us, right? But you don't get busted for drugs very often in this country if you're white. You don't get busted. You get to open a pot shop. You make some money on weed legally, see, the whole thing we need to talk about this, right? Like I'm in favor of decriminalization and legalization myself, but let's just be honest. We got white men who are about to get rich on some stuff that black folks have been going to prison for generations. Just keep that in mind. White folk are going to get rich selling something that black folk have been and will continue even after legalization to go to jail for, because once it's legal, so you have to do it a particular way, right? Or else you're still going to go to jail. Let's just be honest how that's going to go down. You think that's not happening in places like Denver right now, you're not paying attention. As long as you got a license and a storefront, it'll all be good, right? But if you don't, you'll still find a jail cell waiting for you. That is what we're really going to be looking at in this country. So let's just keep that in mind when we think about racial disparity. Right? White folks more likely to have this stuff on us when we're stopped, but less likely to be stopped. And I have to tell you, I didn't even need to look up the CDC data and the Department of Justice data to know that the war on drugs wasn't about drugs. I mean, the data helps, you know, to paint the picture, but you don't even need that. I could have told you that the war on drugs wasn't about drugs just from personal experience. And I can tell you that now because the statute of limitations has expired, so I can just be honest about it. All right? I'm not trying to glamorize drug use, by the way. Just say no, like, no, don't. You know, I got asthma now, so I'm done with all that. But I'm just saying, right? If the war on drugs were about drugs, I don't really know who'd be giving this talk, but it wouldn't be me. Because I don't think they let you Skype in a lecture from prison. I'm not sure, but that's where I would be if this thing were about drugs. But see, I didn't have to worry about that, did I? And I knew I did not. I knew I did not. Not just me, but an awful lot of other folks. A couple of months ago, I did a piece where I looked at the numbers to try to crunch them and figure out statistically, like, if the war on drugs or if arrests for drugs actually mirrored rates of drug use, what would happen as opposed to what does, right? So I was looking at the actual arrest data, let's say for whites and blacks, right, and comparing it to the usage data and therefore possession data for whites and blacks, right, thinking that if the system were equitable, they'd be roughly parallel, right? The rates of arrest would roughly mirror the rates of possession or usage. Of course, they don't. In fact, it's so far off that if the arrest rates and numbers were commensurate with the usage and possession rates, there would be, every year in this country, 160,000 fewer black people arrested for drugs and 160,000 more white people arrested for drugs. Think about that. Over the course of a decade, that's 1.6 million more white folks with a drug record, 1.6 million fewer black folks with a drug record. Think about the impact that would have in our society in terms of who's in jail and who's not, right? In terms of who can get a job now and who can't. In terms of who's going to be allowed to vote in many cases now and who's not. Who can qualify for loans for college now and who can't. If you had 160,000 more of this group and 160,000 fewer of this group, a shift of 320,000 bodies a year, it would transform the prison system. It would change the look of employment. It would change the look of who was able to get into college and who wasn't. because you can't get financial aid if you have a drug record in most cases. So think about that. I mean, here's the bottom line. If the war on drugs wasn't racist, if the war on drugs wasn't something in which white privilege was paramount, there wouldn't be a war on drugs. Because you know full well, if there are 160,000 more white folks a year going to jail for drugs, they'd have legalized all of them a long time ago. White folks not going to let their babies go to prison 160,000 more times a year. They'd be up in arms. This war on drugs is terrible. This has got to stop. But it's precisely because it's black and brown people getting locked up and not white people that hasn't happened. So this is why for people who are advocates for legalization and ending the war on drugs, you better focus on the racial aspect of that, because that's the only reason we got a war on drugs to get angry about in the first place, is because it was racist. If it hadn't have been, it wouldn't have existed. So we just got to be honest about this stuff, and we have to be willing to confront it even when it's difficult. And I know it's difficult. I know nobody likes having this conversation. I know that when you've been in denial about the problem, it's easy to stay there, right? But if we don't talk about it, we just keep looking backward in time, not looking at all this stuff laying ahead of us, we're going to continue to perpetuate these injustices. And I'm trying to figure out why it is that my people, in the narrowest sense of the word, those of us called white, have such a hard time getting this. I mean, it seems so obvious when you tell the stories, right? It seems so obvious when you look at the data. And yet, in spite of those narratives, in spite of those statistics, the majority of white Americans, when asked, still don't believe that there is a problem with institutional or systemic racism. Why is it? Let's ask ourselves why it is, because I don't believe it's because they're mostly bad people. See, I'm one of those folks, and I could be wrong. I actually do believe that most people are good people. I actually do. I've met a lot of people in my life, and a lot of them not so good, but I believe the vast majority are decent human beings who don't want to hurt other people. I believe that most white folks do not wake up wanting to oppress people of color. I think most men do not wake up wanting to oppress women. But I think that, as in the case of sexism, when it comes to race, white folks wake up in a system of inequity, a system of privilege and inequality. And even if you're a good person in a sick system, you're going to have a hell of a hard time doing good. Meanwhile, if you're a bad person in a good system, you're going to have a hard time doing injury. That's why we have to talk about this in systemic terms rather than just individual. But white America doesn't see it, and in some ways we never have. You can go back to those early 60s that we're now in the process of commemorating a half a century later, and you can see the same phenomenon of denial. In 1963, when white Americans were asked, do you believe racial minorities are treated equally in your community, in housing, education, and jobs? 2 out of 3 white folks even then said yes. 1963, the year of the March on Washington, the year all those things, the killing of Medgar Evers, the Birmingham campaign, Bull Connor, 2 out of 3 white folks watching the TV, not getting it. And don't act like they weren't watching the TV and they just didn't see it, because everybody was watching the TV, and there were only 3 stations. It's not like you could get distracted by the Golf Channel and the Game Show Channel and Real Housewives of whatever the hell. Like, those didn't exist. It was 3 stations, and they went off at midnight with the national anthem and then some static until 6 in the morning. And everybody was watching it. You want to know how I know that? Look, last year when Bruno Mars did the thing at the halftime show at the Super Bowl, and they said, 110 million people watched Bruno Mars. Well, 120 million watched the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in a much smaller nation. So you see, everybody was focused. Everybody was focused on the TV, and 2 out of 3 white folks sitting there watching it, and they're like, what? And in 1962, Gallup asked white folks, do you think black children have the same chance at a good education as white children? And 87 out of 100 said yes. 87 out of 100 said yes. What does that tell you? It tells you not that those are necessarily bad people, not even necessarily that they're stupid people, but just that they have the luxury, didn't they, of being completely oblivious to other people's reality. But here's the problem. If you're oblivious to something, don't act like you're an expert. See? If you have the luxury of not knowing something, let's just start with the assumption you probably won't know it. Like, I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all. You know why? Because I didn't take it. You know why I didn't take it? Because they didn't make me. So I was allowed to be oblivious. And as a result, I don't know the first thing about calculus. You know what that means? It means if I were to stand up here in the little bit of time that I have left and started doing calculus, y'all would be very well positioned to say, what the hell? He didn't even take the class. Exactly. But see, when it comes to race, that's sort of what we do. White folks act like we know black and brown folks' truth better than they know it, and we didn't take the class. Men act like we know women's reality better than they know it, and we did not take the class. Those of us who were straight and cisgendered act like we know LGBT folk reality better than they know it, and we did not take the class. Able-bodied people act like we know folks with disabilities reality better than they know it, and we didn't take the class. Anytime you're in the dominant group, you didn't have to take the class. So just own that and admit that you don't know what the hell you're talking about when you try to challenge other people's reality and their sense of their own lived experience. But that's what we do. Like after the OJ verdict, I mean the first one, I know there have been several. Back in 95, right? OJ's acquitted of murder. 2 out of 3 white folks lost our mind. 2 out of 3 black folks were like, I think it was a good verdict. I'm not saying he was innocent. A lot of black folks thought he did it. But they didn't think the burden of proof had been met, and that's the system we have. But white folks lost our mind. Well, this is the most awful thing ever. How in the world? This is a complete travesty. It's like it was the first time that the system ever broke down in white folks' mind was when OJ walked. What in the world? My God, this is just horrible, right? Because in our reality, see, it didn't make sense, right? Because here's the thing. Why did black folk believe it was a good verdict? Well, if you remember the trial, right, you remember that there was a real issue about racism. Most of the blood evidence was found by someone who was a notorious and admitted racist, right, who was found to have engaged in racism many, many times. So when black folks hear that there's an officer who finds a lot of the blood evidence who has that history, it's logical for black folks' alarm bells in their head to go off, right? And for white folks, we didn't understand that. Well, that just doesn't make sense. Planting evidence because you're a racist? That's crazy talk. What do you mean? Because that doesn't happen much in our communities. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's not the normative experience. So we couldn't, and we just thought that black people were being irrational. But who was being irrational? 3 years later, what happened in LA? 3 years later, what scandal breaks in 98, 99? Ramparts Division scandal, an LAPD division that has found what? A dozen officers planting evidence on criminal suspects for crimes they didn't commit. So who was being irrational? That doesn't mean that OJ was innocent, but it means that black folks were not being irrational when they said, hey, you know what? That might have happened, right? But we didn't make the connection because, again, we're oblivious to other folks' reality. We're projecting our reality, and from the white lens, it made sense to think that the claims of planted evidence, the claims of brutality and corruption were irrational. But that's our lens, you see? And when you're a member of the dominant group, you have the luxury of having a distorted lens and not even knowing it's distorted. It's like that movie, The Matrix, which if you haven't seen, you should see. And if you have seen it, you should see it again. And you should watch it with a particular racial lens because it says a lot about race, directly or indirectly. You know, if you've seen the movie, there's a scene early on where Lawrence Fishburne's character, Morpheus, offers Keanu Reeves' character, Neo, 2 pills, one of which is blue, one of which is red. And I'm paraphrasing here, but not by much. Fishburne says to Reeves, look, you can take the blue pill if you want. You can go back to sleep just like everybody else. Most people don't really know what's going on. Most people don't really want to know. In fact, they're willing to die to protect their innocence and their ignorance. And so that's what you want. You don't have to know what's happening. Just take the blue pill, go back to sleep. Or you can take the red pill, and you can have enlightenment, and you can see what's really going on, and I can take you down the rabbit hole and show you how deep it goes. And he takes the red pill, and then he starts to see all the stuff that's really going on in the background of the society, right? He has the veil lifted from his eyes. It's sort of like a perfect analogy to the race situation in the United States. For white folks, it's like we take the blue pill every day, don't even know we're taking it. It's like we're walking around with a blue pill IV drip sticking out of our veins, right? Just schlepping this IV thing around like, what the hell is that? I don't know what that is. What? And then black and brown folks are like, you see all this? You see this racism that's going on? And we're like, no, man, blue pill. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm taking blue pills. I don't know what racism. And black and brown folks are like, see, red pill. You need to take some red pills. Like, no, I'm on the blue. I'm good with the blue. Right here, I'm going to stick with the blue because it allows me to feel innocent and, unbothered, right? But that's the problem. As long as you're on the blue pill, and the same is true with other dynamics, right? Men have the luxury of taking the blue pill, and I know that means a lot of different things in the modern era. I understand. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that. You don't understand that. I'm not talking about that blue pill. I'm not talking about that blue pill. I'm talking about the Matrix blue pill, right? See, Pfizer's done such a number on y'all. Y'all get the joke every time. It's marketing, man. That is capitalism at its worst, right? I tell you, men taking the blue pill, and y'all are just like, damn right, that Pfizer drug. All right? So, see, men have the luxury, though, right, of remaining oblivious to the reality of misogyny, sexism, patriarchy, rape culture. Those of us who are straight or cisgender, we can take the blue pill and be oblivious to straight supremacy, heterosexism, transphobia, et cetera, right? All of these things that, and it doesn't make us bad people. I mean, the fact that I'm oblivious to someone else's truth doesn't make me a horrible human being. It has nothing to do with my character at all. It doesn't even necessarily indict my intelligence. What it indicts is the society in which I'm being raised. It allows me to remain so stupendously ignorant of other people's truth and still be considered educated, right? And still be considered competent, right? How is it possible to become a teacher in this country and not know what I'm talking about before you get the gig? How is it possible to become a law enforcement officer and not know this before you step out on the street? How is it possible to be deemed competent for any profession and not know the way in which racism has shaped so much of our country's history? How do you get to still be called competent and not know these basic things and not have to ever really think about them? And the answer is that in a system of white supremacy, in a system of class domination, in a system of patriarchy, in a system of straight supremacy, in a system of all those types of domination and subordination, the dominant group will always and forever have that luxury of remaining oblivious. That is the only thing that I'm asking us to give up, by the way, because every time, you give these talks, you do this work, and someone will say, white folks get defensive. Well, what are you asking me to do? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to give up? All I want you to give up right now is your obliviousness. That's it. I just want you to give up the veil. Because I feel as if we give up the veil, the rest will follow. We'll figure out what to do next, right? We'll figure out how to act in solidarity with our brothers and sisters of color. We'll learn what it is to be an ally, but you can't learn that until the veil is gone. I'm just asking you to give up the denial. I'm asking you to give up the comfort of believing that this work is not your work and our work. I'm asking you to give up the comfort of sitting on the sidelines while these young black and brown leaders out in the streets are risking their lives, and we're not, right? These young folk post-Ferguson, we should be not only applauding them, we ought to be supporting them. We ought to be out there with them doing whatever it is they need us to do, because they're the ones whose lives are on the line. Instead, what we're doing is we're sitting back and we're judging them too often. And we're saying, oh, their tactics, they're too militant. Oh, they need to do it the way we used to do it in the old days, Why do they have to wear their pants like that? Why they got to listen to that music? Why can't they dress up in nice suits and ties? And why can't the ladies wear dresses? The way we used to back when it was respectable. We got to be respectable. If you're not respectable, nobody's going to treat you with respect. Look, Diane Nash wore a dress. Didn't stop him from arresting her. Didn't stop her from getting beat. C.T. Vivian wore a suit. Didn't stop him from getting beat. They cracked John Lewis's skull open several times. He always had a jacket and tie on. Dr. King was wearing a suit and tie when he was shot. So the idea that the way we present ourselves as protesters is the key to whether or not we gain the respect of the country and make any progress is nonsense. Respectability's never been the key in a system of domination and subordination. The only thing that matters is folks want to keep what they got, and we have to be determined to take it from them. And by it, I mean the ability to continue to take that system for granted. We have to be prepared to snatch that from those who would defend the status quo against all claims of injustice. We have to be braver and stronger and more militant and more determined than they are. And these young people are showing us how to do that if we're prepared to listen to them. They are out there stopping traffic, and I know it bothers people. Why you got to stop traffic? I'm trying to get home on a busy day. It's just going to be 15 minutes of your time. Just chill out. There's more important issues at stake. Or you got these brilliant activists. I think it's really clever, right? They're going in San Francisco, New York, going down into the sort of gentrified areas and doing black brunch, right? Where they just basically go into all the brunch joints where the white folks are having brunch. And they're like, pardon the interruption, y'all enjoy your artisanal grits or whatever the hell y'all are eating. You know, your kale and whatever the hell omelet, your eggs Benedict with truffle oil or whatever the hell that is. We just got to take 4.5 minutes of your time. That's all. That's representing the 4.5 hours that Mike Brown laid on the pavement in Ferguson bleeding out. We're just going to remind you all about Black lives for a minute, then we're out of your hair. Y'all can get back to eating. And folks are irate. My God, I can't even enjoy my bacon. Why do they have to do this here? And people said there's going to be backlash. Yeah, there may be some backlash, but here's the thing. That's why it's such a brilliant tactic. Because if you interrupt somebody's brunch and they actually give you lip about that, they just demonstrated that Black lives don't matter to them. They just proved the very point of the movement. At least we know now where they stand. If we as a nation cannot be inconvenienced by a call for justice, then we don't deserve the country that we have. We don't deserve the opportunities that we've been given to set things right. And see, I happen to believe that we're capable of better than all this stuff I've told you about tonight. And many more that I could have told you about if I had more time. I think we're better than this. And it's funny because every time that you give one of these speeches, and I'm sure you've had it happen to you too, even if you're just in conversation, when you stand up and you criticize the United States of America harshly for its systemic injustice and patterns of abuse, someone always wants to say, well, you hate America and you hate Americans and you're cynical and you don't believe in the country. Actually, it's precisely because I do this work. I think the cynics are the ones who want to tell you that we've arrived at the promised land and don't have any work to do. Because only a cynic could believe that. Only a cynic could actually say, no, you know what? We got 7.5 million people under control of the criminal justice system, 2.5 million of them locked up. That's the best we can do. What is that if not cynical? What is it if not cynical that we accept the fact that right now the typical white family has 20 times the net worth of the typical black family, 18 times that of the typical Latino family? Are we going to say that's the best we can do? That's cynical. Are we going to say that people of color with college degrees being twice as likely as white folks with degrees to be out of work, which is true, that that's the best that we can do? See, only a cynic would say that. Those of us who insist that we can do better than that, we're the ones who actually believe in the people of this country. We're the ones who actually have faith in the ability of people to get it right. That means we are the opposite of cynics. We are not the problem. We are not the ones who hate the country or the people of the country. We are the ones who actually believe in the country and the people of the country and believe that we are capable of, as James Baldwin said, attaining our country for the first time, which we have never done. And so the question for us is, what are we prepared to do? What are we prepared to risk? What are we prepared to sacrifice to stand with these young people who are so brave? What are we willing to do in order to switch from taking the blue pill, which occasionally we've all taken with regard to some system of injustice? If not race, then class. If not class, then gender. If not gender, then sexuality. If not sexuality, then disability. If not that, perhaps religion. Right? We've all been guilty of taking the blue pill, and all that it's going to take for us to create a society of justice is to commit to switching to that red pill, seeing the truth clearly and with open eyes and with an open heart, and being prepared to risk virtually everything in our lives to gain the nation that we were promised and which we have never had delivered to us at any time, that which our parents and grandparents never had, but our children and grandchildren most certainly deserve. And if we don't figure it out quickly, we are going to be in serious, serious trouble. We only have maybe 30 more years left, right, before this country is going to be half people of color, half white. How are you going to maintain a healthy society if we remain this unequal when we're a 50-50 nation? See, that's just not a recipe for success. That's a recipe for utter catastrophe, right? We get to that place, and it is going to happen, y'all. Like, I know there are people who don't like the thought of it. The fact that it's going to be 50% people of color and 50% white. I know there are some white folks real angry. These white folks out in Arizona, right, screaming, "I want my country back, bro!" Right. Yeah, first of all, it wasn't yours, and secondly, you ain't getting it, right? Because I've seen these people, and the average age is about 137 years old. So, TikTok. That's all I'm saying. I don't want them to die, by the way. I hope they live a nice, long life. I'm just saying age is pretty highly correlated with death, and these are generally some older individuals. That's all I'm saying. So they're not going to get the country back if we're prepared to do the work, but we still got to do the work. We still have to do the work, because if we don't, we're going to get to that day, 2043, whatever they say it is, when we're 50% people of color, 50% white, and we're still going to have what? The people of color half, 9 years less life expectancy than the white half, because that's what's going on now. 1/20th the net worth of the white half, because that's what's going on now. Double the unemployment rate, triple the poverty rate, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight kids. You think that's a recipe for a functional economy, a functional culture, a functional society? It's a recipe for utter and complete catastrophe. So this thing we're talking about right now, dealing with white denial, dealing with issues of unearned privilege, and dealing with the issue of systemic racism, whether it's in policing or housing or education or employment or wealth accumulation or any of those arenas. This is not about charity, y'all. That's the point. This is about self-help. This is about figuring out how all of us are going to help ourselves to the country that we deserve. And so I ask you, and I expect of you, to be involved in that struggle from this point forward, and I'm quite confident that you will be. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So let me do some questions for 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to take you out here and sell you some books. That was my subliminal marketing. That was about as subliminal as Pfizer, right about the same. So we'll do that in a minute. But in the meantime, I want to do some Q&A. I think we've got a couple of microphones, right? We got one over here. We got another one over there. So if you have a question, we'll get it to you. And we got one in the back also. We'll get it to you and let you do your thing. And if you're having to leave, I appreciate you coming. Just leave with the least amount of volume possible. That way the questions and the answers can be heard. And in the meantime, before we do a question, I have to say to my friend Sam, you can't leave yet until we have a chance to say hello. Don't head out yet, bro. Okay, just saying. Okay, who's got a question? Yes, right there. We'll start right here. It's great.
All right. So I was wondering why you think law enforcement is so closely tied to violence.
Why law enforcement is so closely tied to violence?
Yep.
Let me make sure I understand the question. So why they are so tied to their own violent behavior, or why they're tied to violence in the larger society? What are we asking? I just want to make sure.
I was kind of wondering, what do you think of like a nonviolent law enforcement system?
I see.
As opposed to the system that we seem to have.
Well, I think it's very clear that we have opted, right, for a method of quote-unquote crime control that is about domination, subordination, and is rooted in violence and always has been. I mean, if you look at the way law enforcement operated historically in this country, from slave patrols to the black codes to vagrancy laws and the way they were enforced with violence, lynching being one and perhaps the most extreme example of the use of violence by law enforcement, but certainly not the only one. And I think that's because law enforcement, at least in this country, was tied to the perpetuation of elite economic domination, and the elite were willing to countenance any amount of violence against the so-called poors of the society, right, who disproportionately were people of color, but even poor whites. And they were willing to countenance intense violence against white union workers who would go out on strike in the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century. They were willing to countenance all types of brutality and violence against them as well. So I think it is part and parcel of a larger system of elite domination rooted in an economic system of inequality, an economic system of hyper capitalism that has led that law enforcement to take on this sort of martial quality, a militarized quality, which now we're seeing ramped up to an even greater degree. And I think the reason that that's happening now is because even worse than the inequalities of, say, 70 and 80 years ago, right before, let's say 80 years ago or so, right before the Great Depression, let's say, or 100 years ago during the Gilded Age and the age of the robber barons. Well, we're seeing levels of inequality today that not only rival those levels, but in many ways surpass them. And we are headed towards a level of wealth inequality, income inequality, resource inequality that is every bit as severe as that. And so What do you do if you're the elite and you're charged with keeping your stuff at all costs from those below you? You have to figure out ways to subordinate them, and oftentimes that will be violent. So you get the tanks for your local police, and you go into your gated community and you hire your private security, or you hire Blackwater to protect you, or whatever it is that you want to do. But it's all this sort of militarized thing because there's a recognition that at some point, the guillotine is coming. And I'm not saying that because I want that to happen. I'm saying that because that's what history tells us happens. When we get to this point of inequality, and the inequalities of this country today are every bit as severe as what was taking place in France before the Revolution. In fact, the inequality in this country today in terms of wealth disparity is double the Roman Empire. Double the level of inequality in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the top 1% owns 16% of the stuff. In this country, they own 33% of it. Right? There are 37 people that own the same amount of stuff as the poorest 157 million people in the United States. That's not a system that can be sustained without violence, because at some point, the folks on the bottom decide this is crazy and we're not going to stand for it anymore. So unless we move toward a much more equitable society and do so pretty quickly, my guess is this will continue to get worse. I would like to think that law enforcement could be done in a nonviolent way. There certainly are countries in the world that do a far better job of that than us. But I think that so long as we are addicted to inequality the way that we are, so long as we continue to rationalize inequality, and we are addicted to the justifications that we make for why some are way up here and some are way down here, we'll never get to a nonviolent, peaceful form of law enforcement or mutual assistance with one another that wouldn't rely on prisons and wouldn't rely on cops and wouldn't rely on guns and tanks and all of these things. Because as long as you have that much disparity, there's going to be anger and there's going to be hopelessness and there's going to be attempts by those on the bottom to take what has been denied them. And so if we want a less violent policing and we want a less violent world, the only way we're going to get there is by dramatically shifting the resources from the very small percentage of people who have an excess amount of them to those vast majority of the rest of the nation and world's population who have been denied them. And unless that happens, I don't see anything that's going to change about law enforcement in a vacuum. Let's just say that. Next question, please. Yes.
Thank you for joining us, and I'm glad that you've had such a good reception here at Portland Community College. Congressman Augustus F. Hawkins, who wrote the Title I law and helped author the Civil Rights Law, left us with a question that's more of a rhetorical question. We wouldn't try to answer it here tonight, but what do you do with a slave when you no longer need his labor?
Right.
I want to see if you would encourage people to see the film Selma so that they might see the power of a nonviolent response to violence. And the question that I have for you is, how likely is it or how functional might it be for you to give this kind of address to an exclusively European American male audience at athletic clubs or country clubs?
Yeah. You're trying to get me killed. No, that's good.
No, you have a good message, but it's going to take those men
Yeah.
to go back to their citizens' councils and carry your message. Thank you again.
Thank you. Let me say this. I definitely think folks should see Selma. And just remember when you're watching it, not to get stuck in that commemorative backward-looking mode, though, because and it's not the fault of the film. The film's excellent, and it's not trying to keep you stuck in that mode by any stretch. But it's important, whenever we look at things that are sort of historically retrospective, that we want to come out of that theater with an idea of how do we apply the lessons of that movement to the lessons of today, and where did the lessons not apply? Because this is the mistake some make when they critique these young activists who are using different methods, different tactics, right? Is we assume that what worked in 65 or 63 or 62 will work today, and it may not. There are avenues of expressing one's discontent and organizing today they didn't have in those days. And so we want to embrace the lessons of the past but not limit ourselves to those lessons. But you should certainly see the film. It's inspiring in a whole lot of ways. As far as this issue of going in front of these sort of all-white, all-male bodies, I've done this before. I don't say I do it often. Most of my speeches, however, I would say they are certainly at historically white colleges and universities, which I know we don't call that. That's an interesting point in and of itself. HWCUs do not exist as such. But of course they do. Most of my speeches are at such places. Most of my talks are to overwhelmingly white institutions. I was at a prep school in Santa Monica yesterday, and the day before that is mostly a white space. And I speak to schools like that all around the country and most of the colleges as well. As far as sort of the old boys club, kind of clubby country club type networks, I am always willing to speak in such places. I am rarely, if ever, asked to speak in such places for reasons that are probably not even remotely shocking to you. But here's the thing, and I'll do it any time. I did actually give one of those talks. I spoke to the Kiwanis Club in Bermuda. Yeah, this was heavy, right? This is a good story. It's not really relevant to the question, but it's funny, so I'll tell it to you. So I was in Bermuda. I was in Hamilton, and I was invited to speak to the Kiwanis Club. There's all these old white men and one black dude, right? He was their black friend, I guess. And they invited me to come speak, and I was on the island doing a series of speeches, and I went there, and they just weren't really buying what I was selling, as you can imagine. And they sort of, Bermuda's got a different racial history than ours, but not dramatically so. Like, they also have a history of enslavement, a history of segregation, all of that, very, very similar. And a lot of racial division in the current era, since there were a couple of administrations in a row, Progressive Labor Party, that were black-run political leadership. And so they bring me in, and they didn't like anything I had to say until I happened to mention to them, which maybe this would work in the United States context as well. Maybe I can play this ancestry card that I'm able to play. But I was able to tell them that my 14th great-grandfather was Christopher Newport. I don't know if you know your history. Christopher Newport is a very interesting story. Christopher Newport was the captain of the ship that shipwrecked on what is now Bermuda in 1607 on its way back to Jamestown from England. And keep in mind the historical importance of this particular shipwreck and what happened after. If you know the story, you know the Jamestown colonists had been dropped off. The boat went back to get more supplies. On the way back, it shipwrecks in a storm on what is now Bermuda. It takes them about a year to repair the boat and then continue on to Jamestown, barely making it in time before the entire colony had starved to death. Right? In other words, if that boat doesn't make it back, which is to say if my 14th great-grandfather doesn't figure out how to get that ship back in the ocean, the entire experiment of European colonization in the Americas may fail, because it would only have been perhaps another year or so until the indigenous confederacy in that region would have united its resources rather than fighting amongst themselves. They may have become strong enough to resist European conquest, which is to say that my 14th great-grandfather is deeply implicated in a highly disturbing way in the history of colonization, conquest, genocide, and white supremacy in this country. But that did not bother the fine white men of the Kiwanis Club in Bermuda. All they knew was, oh my God, you're descendants of the Commodore. That's fabulous. And one said, do you have any pictures of the old boy? I said, this was 1607. No, I don't. I don't have any pictures. And it's like the 14th great-grandfather removed 37 million times. Do you know how many people you're related to when you get back to the 14th great-grandparent? You're related to millions of people. There are probably 100 of people in this room, or at least 20 of you, who are also somehow related to Christopher Newport. It really means nothing, but it impressed them. So maybe I can go into country clubs and say, look at all these really famous, important white people I'm related to, and then they'll listen to me. I don't know. Anyway, end of story. But here's my point. I'd like to go into those spaces, and anytime you get a chance to do it too, you should take it. But let me say this, and I think it's very important when we think about how change is made. I think sometimes we make the mistake of believing that the key to change, that phrase, speak truth to power, right? And it's nice, and it sounds good. But, and I'm not the first to say this. Noam Chomsky has said it, Howard Zinn has said it, many others have said it throughout history, that, power already knows the truth. So the idea that telling powerful people the truth is the key to change presupposes that they don't already know. But they know, and they don't care. So rather than going into elite spaces and telling them what's up in the hopes that they might go, oh my God, we have been wrong all of our lives, which is usually not going to happen, I think it might be more advisable for us, not just me, but for all of us, to not worry so much about getting into those spaces where the elites are. Rather, we just need to marshal our forces and march on their House, march on their Senate, march on their state house, march on their city council, march on their corporate headquarters, and leave them with very little choice but to listen to us. Because in my estimation, that's actually how change is made. When I watch Selma, the thing about Selma that's so inspiring is that, and this is what people are criticizing it for, is that it actually places the credit where the credit is due, not in the lap of Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? The fact that they don't want to make LBJ the hero of that story has got a lot of people twisted all out of shape. Oh my, how can you say that, because that's a lie. He wasn't the savior. He wasn't the hero, right? And the movement was strong enough, frankly, that no matter who, now, did it help that he was president as opposed to Goldwater that year? Yeah. But are you going to tell me that Barry Goldwater or later on Richard Nixon or anybody could have resisted the moral force of that movement if it continued to do its work? See, I don't believe that. I believe that there was an inevitability that that movement would grow to a point where it would force change. That change comes from the bottom up. So sometimes, even though I'd like to go talk to those folks, if for no other reason, just sort of jack up their day a little bit, give them a little higher blood pressure than they had when they came in, I mean, that'd be fine. There's some fun in that. But beyond that, I sometimes don't want to talk to them. I sometimes think it might be better if they don't know what we're up to until we're there. Like, I don't want you to know what we're plotting. I don't want you to know what we're thinking. Just trust me, you'll know when we show up. How about that? How about that? Next question. Next, yes, right here. Be great. Yes.
How do you address implicit bias, particularly as it relates to law enforcement?
Implicit bias, particularly as it relates to law enforcement, how do you address that? Well, I think, first let's understand, if we're going to get a handle on implicit or subconscious or unconscious bias, the first thing is we have to acknowledge the role that it plays in all of our lives. And not just cops, all of us. Now, when it plays a role for cops, it's obviously potentially more deadly, so that's a bigger qualitative problem. But we all have this, and I think part of getting our head around it and getting success in changing it is to really have in every professional setting, not just law enforcement, but in every setting, in every educational setting, conversations when people are hired, when people are promoted, when opportunities are given to people to understand how common implicit bias is. And the research on it suggests, for instance, that although you can never completely root out subconscious bias in all likelihood, you can condition people to interrupt the thought before it becomes the deed, right? In other words, I might still have the thought, but I can train myself to see the thought, catch the thought, and essentially short-circuit the thought, like with a firewall almost, like on a computer, before it becomes a discriminatory act. Now, that takes a lot of repetition, right? Because the reason we have subconscious bias is because of repetition. The repetition of stereotypes that we've been exposed to over and over and over and over again. And so if you see enough advertisements for a consumer product, the people who sell you stuff know that there's a greater likelihood you're going to go buy their junk, right? The same is true with racial stereotypes. If you see those enough, the odds are pretty good that at least occasionally you're going to fall into a trap and act on them. Now, we can counter-condition with counter-stereotypical information. We can counter-condition by requiring people to learn about implicit bias in whatever job they're in, particularly policing. But I also think that at some level, we can do all the training in the world, and we should do some. And we can, try to counter-condition people away from their biases, and we should do that. But I think we also have to protect ourselves from those subconscious biases by having institutional policy changes that essentially will, at the very least, remove the worst aspects of those biases and the damage they do. So here's what I mean by that. I'd like to think that we could counter-condition cops not to have subconscious bias, but at the very least, I think what we could do, and I think this would actually help reduce subconscious bias, is say that communities have to have a role in deciding who's going to police their neighborhood, right? Because if a community has input into who is allowed to police their neighborhood, what is that going to force the cop to do? That means if I want to be a cop in North Portland, I either got to live there and build up relationships with the people, or if I don't live there, I still better get into that neighborhood, meet people, learn who's there, build relationships before I apply for the job, and certainly before I get it, because think about how that would help. Not only will that build trust, but it also would likely reduce subconscious bias, because once you get to actually know people, once you start building relationships, once you realize that your stereotypes don't actually comport with the reality of most of the people you interact with, then the odds of you acting on a hair trigger in the way that a Darren Wilson did, for instance, would be diminished. So whether we have a residency requirement, which is ideal, but I realize sometimes there might be instances in the country where you're not going to be able to get enough folks to police who have to live in the community. But at the very least, if you don't live there, you sure as hell better be able to get into that community, meet with folks, sit down with the civic leaders. It's just like with gentrification generally, right? If you think about gentrification in this area, right, it isn't, I think most people don't understand that it's not so much that folks don't want people to move into an area, but if you're going to move into an area, you got to take up the causes of the people that have been in that area. You got to work with the people who've always been there. And if you're willing to move into an area and that hasn't been your home before, because now it's the cool, hip place to be, fine, but when you get in there, you better attach to the movement work that's been going on. You better get involved with the locals who've been there dealing with police violence and brutality, people that have been dealing with housing unaffordability, people that have been dealing with failing schools. And if you come in and do that, not only will you gain the respect of the community, but you will also become a real partner in that community. So I feel like we can train the cops not to have the bias, but more importantly, if we had that kind of a policy requirement that the community's going to vote on who gets to police, and they're going to vote on who gets promoted, and they're going to vote on who gets fired and who gets to stay and who doesn't, then all of a sudden my incentive is I better get to know you. Because otherwise, I'm not going to be able to be a cop in this community. And in order to get to know you, I'm probably going to have my biases challenged. And if I find myself unable to do that, then I know I need to go find another line of work. And of course, we also have to do other things just in case none of that works on the back end, which among those things would be ensuring that when police misconduct happens, that it is not left to local prosecutors to take the cases to grand juries. Because the idea that even the most fair-minded DA or county prosecutor is going to be able to set aside their personal relationships with the cops, who they have to work with every day in order to make legitimate cases against actual offenders, is just nonsense. It just doesn't work that way. There's no way to believe that even the most conscientious DA is going to be able to do that. There have to be special prosecutors in all of these cases without any connection to the locals so that we can actually get this job done correctly. And I would say those are at least a couple of things in the way of reform that we need to see happen. Other questions? I'm going to come over here to this side if there is one. Yes, you have one right there? Yeah, go ahead. We'll get you a mic there. Go ahead.
Mr. Weiss?
Yes, please.
Thank you for being here.
You bet.
You once said that in order to confront the realities of racism, we must constantly inform ourselves and listen to what people of color are saying and are often ignored for.
Right.
Now, the following excerpt was written by Jen Jackson after interviewing you for her blog series, Preaching to the Choir.
Yep.
Weiss has commoditized the work of being an anti-racist activist and a white ally, even whilst doing very little with other people of color doing the work themselves. He touts his black supporters as a means of silencing people of color who doubt his sincerity and authenticity. He sees allyship as a day job and would certainly count himself amongst its leaders, as would many other white people. And therein lies the problem. So my question for you, Mr. Weiss, is what might you have to learn then from this and other similar criticism from people of color?
Well, Jen and I actually have a very good relationship, and I don't know if you saw the follow-up to that particular piece. She interviewed me again. We talked about it. I thanked her for that particular column because I thought there were some really good points made in it. I thought there were other points which she also later agreed probably hadn't been fair. But in all, I thought it was a very valuable criticism, and I learned a lot from it. I said so immediately afterward on social media, and I believe in an essay that I wrote at the time. So we talked about it quite a bit, and I was talking about it for probably 3 or 4 weeks after that piece came out and after the follow-up came out because I thought it was incredibly valuable. So I try to, in every instance of criticisms, even if I don't think they're valid, and I thought a lot of Jen's points were very, very valid, even if I have a disagreement with those who issue them, I always try to listen to them. I try to take them very seriously. I try to engage in some dialogue with whoever that individual may be, and have done so repeatedly over the years, will continue to do so. I think that any of us who are trying to be allies, and I say trying to be because ally, it is a verb much more than a noun. It's what you do more than what you say. I think those of us who are aspiring to that have to always take the stance that no matter how a particular criticism may or may not be fully accurate of something that we've said or done, that we have an obligation, if we're going to do this work, to take all of those seriously enough to hear them, to listen to them, to sit with them, and to reflect on what we could do better. And in the wake of that particular piece, one of the things that she and I talked about was the way in which I try, and I think sometimes succeed and probably sometimes fail, to work with, contrary to the claim in that original piece, work with activists of color, promote the work of activists of color, promote the words of activists of color, using whatever platform I have. I mean, the only real power that I possess within the work, right, is the power of being heard and having my voice amplified precisely because I'm a white male, precisely because I have the privilege that comes with that particular set of identities and being straight and cisgendered and all of those things. So what I try to do, and again, sometimes succeed, sometimes don't, is to use that platform, use that amplified voice to promote the work of not only Jen herself, whose work I promoted, but a lot of other writers of color who maybe don't get nearly as much attention, who don't get out on the road to speak as often, trying to get them speaking engagements, trying to get them workshops and sessions where they can meet with other activists around the country, because I think that's something that I can do. If I have a lot of people who are paying attention to what I'm saying, and among the things I'm saying is, hey, I'm really glad you like my writing, I'm really glad you follow my work, but please go read these folks, and please bring them to your campus, and please listen to what they're doing. And one of the reasons since Ferguson that I've really sort of stayed out of that movement at a real high level is precisely so as not to take up space in a movement that is being brilliantly led mostly by young women of color and other folks of color generally. So I'm purposely not getting in on the phone calls where they discuss strategy, because I got nothing to tell them. I got nothing to add. I have nothing. They are doing it, and they know exactly what they're doing. They don't need my advice. They don't need my input. They certainly don't need me and others like me trying to micromanage their movement. But what I can do is I can come to a place like this and promote that movement and implore people to join with that movement and to give them the respect that they deserve and to support them in any way possible, morally, financially, with your bodies, with your time. That's something that I can do and something that I do. And I think as long as I continue to do that, I'm going to no doubt make mistakes. I'm going to do some things right and I'm going to do some things wrong. And all that any of us can do when we do things wrong is expect to be called out, accept the calling out. Doesn't mean that everything that we're called out on is accurate. Doesn't mean that every criticism has to be taken so seriously that it changes our behavior, because after all, there are lots of different voices of color. Jen's is one. And others who have critiqued me and other allies, they are others who have done so. But there are millions of different voices. It is impossible, by definition, to be perfectly accountable to all critics. But what I can do is listen to all critics. And what I can do is try to figure out, what does the critique say, not just to me, but all white folks and white men trying to do this work. And so I appreciated Jen's particular criticism. I have appreciated the criticisms of others. And there have been, several throughout the years that have come down, which make perfect sense. Why wouldn't there be? I've said for years that if I were a person of color, there's no way that I would trust any white person who said that they were an ally just because they said they were an ally. It's always about following up. It's always about checking in. It's always about making sure that when you do right, that's great. And when you don't, we'll mention it to you and we'll tell you what you could do better. So, I mean, I guess that's the answer to the question, is I learned a lot from that. I've learned a lot from others. And I think that once Jen and I, in particular, had a conversation about some of the allegations that had been made, which, by the way, were not so much hers as they were another individual who had decided to actually say some things on Twitter that had been thoroughly inaccurate, but which Jen did not know were inaccurate at the time, which she then proceeded to write about, and we straightened all that out. Again, a lot of people's sources are bad, not just mine, and I'm not the only one who said intemperate things on Twitter. So we had a conversation about what that meant, and it was a valuable conversation, and all I've done since is try to be very transparent about the mistakes that I made in the instances that she was referring to and the way that I could do the work better. But I think that's all any of us can do, is just listen and be prepared to make changes when changes are recommended or when suggestions are made. I'm not sure that there's any other thing that we can do other than maybe step back from things, which is what I've tried to do since the Ferguson movement, just try to step back from any active sort of manipulation of that work. I try not to be involved in that space. I think that the people doing it are doing a far better job than I could do. Other questions? Let's go right to the middle here. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Wise. Mm-hmm. Thanks for your time today. My question is, Trudy, a writer and owner of blog Gradient Layer, states, Black people who speak out against racism have lost quite a bit, while whites, whether they're as racist as they or profit from being anti-racism, win. This would be white supremacy. With this being said, what qualifies you as experienced to speak out about racism when you yourself are white, powerful, and privileged?
I think if I spoke about the black and brown experience as my central focus, that I wouldn't be qualified to do that, which is why what I talk about typically is whiteness, right? What I'm talking about is something that I know very well because I'm embedded in it. So I guess what qualifies any individual for speaking about a system within which they're embedded is their embeddedness and the extent to which they are aware of their embeddedness. And whether or not I'm an expert, I don't presume to be one. I'm observant, as are other people, about the system, and so I share what I consider to be truth about that system, and then people are obviously free to determine for themselves whether it's true or not. I am very quick to point out in all instances of my writing and in speech after speech that most of the wisdom that I possess about the system of racism, and indeed the system of whiteness, is wisdom that came from my mentors of color and teachers of color with whom I worked, mostly in New Orleans, but also in other places around the country. I'm very quick to credit them for that, because without that mentorship, there's very little likelihood that I would possess even a scintilla of whatever knowledge I do possess. So I don't know whether it makes me qualified or not, but I know I had some very good teachers, and those teachers were mostly people of color, and they were people of color who told me very directly. It wasn't something that I perceived them to say, but they said it in no uncertain terms, that it was incumbent upon me and other white folks to go forth and to talk about whiteness and to challenge white denial. That was a job we had to do. And they, of course, were in turn taking that direction from what had been said in the late 60s when SNCC told white folks, when whites were essentially purged from SNCC, said, no hard feelings, but we need y'all to go talk to your people. And we need y'all to go out and do that work with white folks, because we can't. They won't listen to us. We can't get their ear. Maybe you can. So you go do that. We're going to work on building with our people. You go work on challenging your people, and then maybe we can meet back in the middle. That has been the advice. It was the advice Malcolm X gave near the end of his life in the last year and a half. It was the advice that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture gave. It was the advice that most of the black and brown folk in SNCC were giving by 67. And it's still, I think, and my mentors certainly seem to think, was valid advice. But I do try to focus on the whiteness piece of it, because I don't think it would make sense for people of color to necessarily focus on the white condition. That would seem odd. I mean, I think if I were a person of color, I'd want to talk about my situation, not white folks' situation and how jacked up they are. But that seems to be a very legitimate place for me to start, at least it seems. As far as whether or not there's any loss involved, I think there's no doubt that the greatest risk in speaking out against racism is borne by people of color. I mean, that goes without saying. The greatest risk in speaking out against patriarchy and misogyny are borne by women. The greatest risk speaking out against straight supremacy and transphobia, for instance, are borne by LGBT folks. I mean, there's no doubt. And certainly the greatest risk in fighting the class system is borne by poor people. We can see all that, we can acknowledge that that is true, and it is true, it's inarguably true, and yet we're still left with this hanging question that we all have to answer at some point, because every one of us is a member of some privileged group. There's no one in this room whose all-consuming identities are marginalized. I've never been in such a space. Everyone in the room has got at least one identity, I assure you, where you're the dominant group. And so when you're in that group, you got to decide, yeah, you may not risk as much as someone in the marginal group, but does that mean you don't speak out? Does that mean you only speak out on Sunday? Does that mean you only speak out in your spare time at the end of your work week? Does that mean that you only speak out when you're talking to friends but not on social media? Does it mean you only speak out unless you get attention for speaking out, and then once you get attention, you don't speak out anymore? Like, at some point, these are all questions we have to ask. And they're complicated, because there is no doubt that when you speak out from a place of privilege, which, you know, if you are not poor and you challenge poverty, you're doing that. If you're not LGBT and you challenge straight supremacy, you're doing that. If you're not Muslim and you challenge Islamophobia, you're doing that. But if you don't do it, what is the cost? What is the consequence of the silence relative to the cost of the complicated catch-22 use of your voice, which can definitely become too loud and can definitely become abusive and can definitely manifest privilege? These are balancing acts, and I don't know the perfect way to balance them. I don't know that any of us have figured that out, right? I think it's a question of constantly revisiting that question and figuring out how you can speak from a place of privilege, challenging a system of inequality, and yet not do violence to those who are marginalized by making sure that if you're going to speak out with, not on behalf of, but with a marginalized group, what can you be doing to bring them along in that conversation, to expose their voice to more people, to lift them up and their example up, so that it isn't just you who's either getting eyeballs on your blog or social media, or getting money from speaking engagements, or getting book sales, or whatever it might be, getting clicks on a tweet or something along those lines. That seems to me something we can all do. We can all figure out, my policy in social media is, for anything that I write, let's say about race, and like a original essay of some form, I try to make a habit of sending out anywhere between 5 and 10, usually closer to 10, pieces that have been written by people of color, or videos of people of color talking about those issues, because I want to sort of front load the discussion with the voices of people of color. Doesn't mean I don't have things to say, and I'm going to say them, and here's my essay, and you can read it or not, or here's a book, but I want to make sure people also know about these other voices as a way to spread the attention as broadly as I can. That doesn't take away my privilege, and even the fact that I have the ability to do that is still a privileged thing. But I guess, the hanging question is, what's the alternative? If the alternative is that we don't do it, or we do it but we can't do it and make any money from it, we can only do it as a hobby, like rock climbing, there are people who've suggested this, like you can do it, but you can't make any money from it, which is an interesting argument. I sort of get it. Like, I think there are legitimate discussions about how much money anyone in this country should make for any job they do, and how much they need to give back, and those are legitimate discussions. I don't think we would ever, tell a lot of other professions that are supposedly intended to be for good purposes that they can't get paid. I don't think we would say that people who work in anti-poverty organizations should be paid sub-poverty wages, or else they're not real, or that doctors shouldn't be paid because then they don't really want to heal people, they just want money, or teachers shouldn't be paid because they're profiting off ignorance. It's sort of at some point, I'm just saying, these are arguments that get made. Those are arguments that get made, right? Is that somehow getting paid for the work that you do diminishes the legitimacy of the work? I think that that's problematic. I think that what we need is a system whereby folks of color can also support themselves off their words and their art and their, truth, and whether that's as activists, or whether that's as poets, or whether that's as musicians, or whether that's as visual artists, whatever that is, that's what we need. I want to see more folks able to do that. And the way that I can do that is someone who is in this work, as an educator and gets attention, is to make sure that I'm promoting those efforts. Whether I'm qualified to do it, that's going to, be something that other folks will have to obviously, determine. I either know what I'm talking about or I don't. What I'm talking about is either valuable or it's not. It's certainly no more valuable than the words of anyone else. And like I said, I'm very quick to point out that the people who taught me were mostly people of color, and we need to go to the source of that wisdom, read what they're reading or writing, listen to their speeches. And let me say to everyone in the room, the next time that a person of color is asked to come to this campus and to speak on these issues, and I know I know Michelle Alexander was here from what I understand, but when folks of color come, I hope that this room will be as packed as it is today and as it is tonight, because it certainly should be, and it would be really a shame were it not. And so for anyone who's out there, make sure that when there are folks of color who are coming to talk about these issues, that you're not only are you coming, but you're encouraging your friends to come, so that this room is every bit as packed, because they deserve your support as well. Let's go over here. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's very clear that in this country, the Black Lives Matter concept is aspirational, but it's not real in this country right now. That's for sure. We have a system that says in every possible way that black lives don't matter, and that brown lives don't matter, or at least they certainly don't matter as much as white lives. And this idea that a lot of nice, and reasonably white liberal people have come back, like you said, with this all lives matter reaction to that. As true as it is that all lives matter, it doesn't have to be said. Just like, it'd be like, I don't remember who it was. There was somebody on Twitter that, wrote this really sort of brilliant set of reactions to that. It was an Asian blogger and writer and activist, and I don't know, I can't remember his name, but he made this brilliant point. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, to say in response to Black Lives Matter that all lives matter, be like, running through a meeting dealing with HIV/AIDS and yelling about, well, people die of other diseases too, like cancer, like that. That's not a reaction, right? You don't try to draw attention to another truth by trying to diminish the existing truth. And what we have in this country is a system that is very clearly predicated on the subordination of black bodies and black lives and brown bodies and brown lives, first and foremost by the criminal justice system, but by other systems as well. And so I think as long as that is happening, it is perfectly appropriate not only for black and brown folk to push back and to insist that their lives matter and will be seen and that their truth will be heard, but to demand that any and all attempts to diminish that, any and all attempts to water that down, any and all attempts to marginalize that voice are just other versions of white supremacy, just other iterations of white supremacy, racism 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, but still racism. So I applaud you and anything that you're doing to get your truth out is something that I support and that we all should support, because that truth is the truth that we have up to now been refusing to hear. And so I agree with you completely. Other questions real quick. Take a couple more. Yes, right there.
Thank you for being here and for all the times you've come here. And I've read a number of your works. This morning on community radio, I heard a talk by an author. You may know his name, and I don't remember his name. But what his book has to do with is that evidently there's been research that really points out that one of the nests or the nucleus of police racism are police unions.
Yeah.
That's the real source. As a matter of fact, most police organizations aren't uniformly vicious and racist. But there are core groups within every police department, and police unions, as a la Chicago, a la New York, and a lot of other cities, that really fosters a lot of the kind of racism. And so are you aware of any city or municipality has addressed that issue?
No.
At all?
I'm not aware of any that have addressed it with any real fortitude, but I will say you make a very good point. And just to let people know, I mean, it's almost ridiculous to even refer to police unions as unions. They're not unions. They are criminal protection rackets in most cases. That's what they do. I mean, and here's why that's not hyperbole. Here's why there's real legitimacy to me saying that. If you're a union, like let's say you're a steel worker, right? Who are you represented by? The United Steelworkers, if you have a union contract. There's not like 15 different versions of steelworker unions that are all competing for members trying to, get over on each other. You got one strong union. Now, you might have a couple unions vying in certain, like hospitality industry. You might have a couple different folks. You might have Unite. You might have SEIU. You might, there might be, but in large trade unions, normally it's one union. Everybody's in it. That's where solidarity comes from. That's where strength comes from. In New York City, they have multiple police unions. It isn't just the one that Brother Lynch runs. Right? That's the biggest one. That's the Fraternal Order of Police. But they got like 5 or 6, maybe more. They have multiple police unions. Why do you need half a dozen or more police unions, even though it's a huge city with a lot of cops? Why you got to have all these different fiefdoms within that? Well, that can't be about just worker representation. That's what union's supposed to be about, getting better contracts, right? Worker representation, worker rights, protections, pensions, things like that. Why you need 5 or 6 or 7 to do that? You don't. So what that is you've got a bunch of political entities that are ideology driven. You've got police unions that are mostly populated by officers of color. And they have a very different agenda, oftentimes, usually, compared to the police unions that are predominantly white. And then you even have multiple unions that are predominantly white that have different politics. And even within the one right now that Lynch runs in New York, now they got internal squabbles in there too. But, so this is about, it seems to me pretty apparently, this is more about protection of individuals' careers, and promotions of individuals' careers and political strength and power within city government in places like New York, places like Chicago, maybe to some extent LA. I'm not sure if it's quite as bad there, but a lot of large cities, than it is about what you would normally think of as a union. And I think that until those unions are brought under the control, the democratic control of a process that is less autocratic and gives less power to such individuals, and until those unions are prepared to stop defending every act of misconduct, I can't think of a single case where the Fraternal Order of Police didn't defend, no matter what it was, the actions of their brothers and sisters, mostly brothers in blue. When Abner Louima was savagely assaulted in that bathroom in New York City, and one of those officers did in fact get a pretty long prison sentence, the Fraternal Order of Police was outraged, even though there was no doubt about what this man had done to Abner Louima, but it was seen as this horrible brutalization of the police union. There's not a single case that I can find where they have said, you know what, you went too far. Like, we're not, we may be contractually obligated to help you find a lawyer because that's in the contract, but we are not going to go to bat for you in the public. But they go to bat for them in the public every single time. So I think, I really think it's time to talk about, when it comes to police unions, whether or not these are archaic institutions, whether or not we should afford them the same respect that we do to other unions. I certainly don't have the same respect for them, and I don't see them as brothers and sisters in the fight for workers' rights until they are prepared to see the people that they police as brothers and sisters with larger constitutional and human rights in the communities where they operate, and they clearly at this point don't have that. Now, I don't know of any cities that have tried to maybe dial back some of the power. There may be some. I'm not personally familiar with them, but that is a very serious problem because those institutions wield an outsized amount of power on everything from who the chief might end up being in a particular community to, wielding a lot of political clout in mayoral elections, and mayoral politics. Remember, the New York Police Department damn near rioted back in '93 when Dinkins was mayor, right? Yelling racial slurs at him, throwing things at him, screaming at him. I mean, literally just about had a full-scale riot. And, they didn't clean house when that happened. They should just cleaned house with that police department. Should have fired as many of them as possible, ended as many careers as possible. And, when you've got a police union that's saying what they did in New York was, we're just not going to do our job. You don't like us? You want to criticize us? That was the best thing that happened in New York in like months, years. The cops refused to go out and arrest anybody for petty crimes. And then what happened? Did the city explode? Did people go nuts? Did they start committing all kinds of horrible crimes? No. Like, all of a sudden, people were getting along. What do you know? Like, you didn't arrest me for throwing a cigarette on the ground, and what do you know? I did not go from that to armed robbery the next week. What do you know? Like, this broken windows policing stuff is nonsense. So the union, but having said that, as positive as that ended up being, the fact that they were so insubordinate as to say we're not going to do the job that we have been hired to do means, cool, y'all all get fired tomorrow. Do the job or go on strike. If you want to, I don't know if they even have the right to strike. I'm not really even sure what the protections are in that regard. But if y'all don't want to do your job, then find another job. It's cool. The economy's great. I'm sure you'll have no trouble, right? Go ahead and leave your job, and we'll fill these jobs with people that actually want to protect the community, who are from the community, as opposed to these folks who come in from Staten Island into a part of the city that they don't even like, let alone do they want to live in. So, I don't have any doubt that part of this is going to be about breaking the power of police unions and dialing back their ability to defend at all cost even the most brutal of their members. A couple more real quick, and then we'll let you get out of here, sell you some books, whatever it is. Anybody else? Yes, we'll go back here and then here. So right there and then right there. Yeah. I think you want to get together with these folks that are there are a lot of folks in Portland for many years that have been doing incredible work around police violence issues, been doing incredible work around gentrification, the downside effects and the harms of gentrification. I think it's about getting with those folks and listening, not going in necessarily imposing any kind of an agenda or even showing up and saying, I'm here to help, what can I do? Like that's messed up. We don't want to do that, right? But going to those meetings, going to those community meetings, listening to what people are saying, listening and going to the next one and listening again and paying very close attention to what some of the needs might be that you might be able to help with, right? And once you start showing up in those spaces, right, in those community meetings, in those protests and demonstrations, in those whatever it might be, once you start showing up over and over and over again and showing that you're interested in learning and listening and growing as an individual and let's say trying to be of help to the larger struggle, then you start building relationships, then you start building trust, and then people who are doing that work might be willing to say to you, hey, you know what, here's what we need for you to do. Right? You've been coming around. We really like that. We appreciate that. Here's what we need you to do. And sometimes the stuff that you might get asked to do isn't even remotely like seemingly political, but is still really powerful and important. So several years ago in Seattle, some of the folks that I know there who were doing white anti-racist work as aspiring allies started doing some of this stuff I'm talking about. They would go to meetings. They didn't always talk or participate or throw out strategy ideas. They just would listen. They would listen to folks of color. They would learn from folks of color. They would be open to any suggestion folks of color made about what they might do. And after building these relationships over several years, which were not perfect and were still fraught with issues, what ended up happening was that one night or one day, whatever it was, the folks of color said, hey, we got something we need y'all to do. And I'm sure they were very excited. Oh, great, we get to do something. This is great, wonderful. And basically they said, we're going to have a meeting next Thursday, a really important meeting. I don't remember what it was about exactly, what the strategy was they were discussing or what the issue was. But they said, we're going to have this meeting, and we need to have this meeting at like 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, and we don't need y'all to come, white folks. What we need you to do is we need you to cook the meals for the meeting, and we need you to provide childcare for the meeting, for our kids, so that we can go and we can get our stuff straight. So we need you to do childcare, and we need you to cook, and we need you to come and clean after it's done. We don't need you in on it. We don't need your advice. We don't need your input. We just need you to do this so it frees up time and space for us. And that ended up being an incredible thing, because that was something which they were able to do, which made it possible for the folks of color to get the work done that was really important, that needed to be done. But the only way that was something that they even could ask for, and the fact that they were able to receive that request in the spirit that it was intended, was they had started to build relationships. And so I think the biggest mistake that we make sometimes is when we get amped up about injustice, particularly if we're coming at it from a dominant group place and a place of privilege, is we just want to get in there and just start changing it right now, because when you're the dominant group, you have that mentality that, by God, I can fix whatever I put my mind to. I just got to put my mind to it, and I'll take care of it. And marginalized group folks know that's not how it works. So there's a certain amount of patience we have to have. And that means listening to folks of color, learning from folks of color, doing whatever it is they say they need us to do. And if right now that's nothing, if right now they say, hey, all we need you to do right now is maybe challenge your neighbors, challenge the people in your kid's school, challenge your colleagues at work, because those conversations are important. Maybe we don't need you at the demonstration or the die-in at the mall, but we might, like out in the Bay Area, and in New Orleans as well. Black and brown activists in the post-Ferguson environment were telling white activists, here's what we need you to do. We're going to do this action. We need you to get between us and the cops. In New Orleans, they said, we're going to do the die-in. We're going to lay on the ground. We need you to form a circle of protection around us so that the cops decide to charge us, you get charged first, right? That's heavy. That's real. And that's something which they asked, and then we got to be prepared to do it if that's what folks ask. Or if they say, hey, right now, we just need a rally to be just us. We don't need you doing that at all. But here's a few things, and then we go do that. Or they might say, don't do anything. And then, all right, that's fine. That's usually not what they're going to ask or what they're going to say. They're going to give very specific kinds of ideas, but they're not likely to do that at all if you're not in the space, listening, learning from them, and showing up sometimes just to demonstrate some level of solidarity and build relationship and get to know the folks who are really leading the struggle. So I would say to do that, to find a way to be in that space. Not necessarily as an active agent of change, so much as a recipient of the wisdom and the relationship building that will allow you to be a better ally, and then they'll direct what is needed next, I would think. Then I said I was going to come. Where did I say? Oh, right there. There we go. Can we do this one? Last question. Okay, so here we go. Is that cool? Yes. Go ahead. What the prison abolition movement needs to do in order to be successful. You know, I don't know that I have the answer to that. In fact, I'm fairly confident that I don't. I think first of all, we have to think of success with that or any other movement as a very sort of partial set of steps, because, you know, right now as a country, we're so far from getting people to understand prison abolition. That's going to take some work. I mean, I'm certainly in favor of prison abolition, by which I mean, and I don't know if everybody means the exact same thing by it, most of the people with whom I'm connected in the prison abolition movement are not denying that there are times when individuals have to be incapacitated and incarcerated. But there's a very big difference between occasional incapacitation and incarceration and the creation of a virtual gulag, which is what we've done in this country, mostly for nonviolent offenders who clearly don't need to be handled in such an inhumane way. So prison abolition means abolishing the prison industry, abolishing this complex, this web of incarceration where 2.5 million people currently locked up, 7.5 million on probation or parole or locked up. For me, what needs to happen is, and this would be true not just with prison abolition, I think this is true with any aspect of the liberation struggle, what's going to get us there, or at least closer to there, is we're going to have to really craft a counter narrative that's based in stories and personal experience, more so than data and facts and academic analysis. I think that it's important to know statistics and data and analysis, and so I offered some this evening, but it's every bit as important to tell those stories that whether we're talking about police brutality, the story of what happened to John Crawford, the story of what happened to Tamir Rice, the story, for those of us who were white, of all the times that we've engaged in those same kind of activities and lived to tell the tale. Those stories are more persuasive than even the best academic analysis, because those are the things that build human connection. The problem right now is not that we don't have the facts on our side to justify prison abolition or to justify massive changes in the way the justice system operates. We've always had the facts on our side, I think. But what we haven't had is the narrative. The dominant narrative right now says what? People are dangerous. We have to control them, right? So unless we have some kind of counter narrative that rehumanizes those who have been dehumanized, right? That rehumanizes them and attaches the larger discussion to the idea that, you know, we're not the worst thing we ever did. You know, I used to do anti-death penalty work for a period, and that was one of those lines that was very common in the death penalty abolition movement was, you know, you wouldn't want to be judged by the worst thing that you ever did. That's not the sum total of your humanity, but we treat those who were offenders, and now I'm talking about those who are actually guilty of the crimes for which they've been convicted, which is certainly not everyone. But even those who are not the sum total of their offenses. That is not the entirety of their humanity, but we've allowed this narrative to be crafted that says it is, and so we're going to have work on that, which means those of us who have connection to people who have been incarcerated, and many of us do, more of us than probably we realize, have some connection to individuals or families that have been affected by mass incarceration. We're going to have to start talking about that openly. We're going to have to start talking about that so we can create a counter narrative that does that rehumanizing, because otherwise people just sort of stay stuck where they are. And this is true with every issue that we work on. I think the mistake that we make sometimes, people on the left, is that those of us on the left are, I think, unhealthily committed, or this isn't the right way to say it, to justify the assault on social safety nets that he launched, but he told a really good tale, most of them fabricated stories of individuals who either did not actually exist or were composites of several people, or whose misdeeds he grossly exaggerated, as in the case of Linda Taylor, the so-called welfare queen, who he said used 150 names and 75 addresses and made off with $1 million of taxpayer money. Actually, it was 3 aliases, 2 addresses, and $8,000, but who's counting? Right? But it made for a better story, and people believed it. So I think part of what we have to do, whether it's prison abolition, whether it's universal health care, whether it's, I mean, just any issue you care about, I think for every sort of data point, every statistic, every fact, make sure that you've also got some stories to go along with it. Because the problem right now is not that powerful people don't know the facts. They all got the position paper from the Children's Defense Fund. They all got the position paper from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, or whatever other Institute for Policy Studies, whatever liberal think tank you want to name that puts out facts about why these policies are dysfunctional, they've seen all that and they've decided not to care. And I think the reason is because they know at this point they still control the terms of the discussion. They still control the narrative and the storytelling. And that piece is one that I think we have to get a lot better at. And we all, I think, can tell and share some of those stories. Just like I think we can share stories, and I'm writing about this for my new book, which is really focused more on economic inequality than purely racial inequality. It's the same thing there. I mean, instead of, I could have had at the end of the book a whole section about policy proposals for addressing wealth inequality and policy proposals for addressing income inequality and eradicating poverty, but I knew that none of the proposals that I might put out there are going to mean anything if we don't craft a counter-narrative to the culture of cruelty that diminishes our respect for poor and working class people. So instead of any of those recommendations, all I said there was what we have to do is every single one of us who have benefited from state intervention in the economy, whether that's with student loans, whether that's with tax refunds and rebates or mortgage interest deduction if you're a homeowner, or whether it's going to public school, or whether it's having GI Bill benefits back in the day, or an FHA loan for your family, either in this generation or a prior generation, whatever it is, we've all benefited from state intervention in the so-called free market, but we don't tell those stories because we're so caught up in the narrative of rugged individualism that we want to be able to take credit for whatever we accomplish in this society. By God, I did it all on my own. I don't want to admit all the help that I got, either the help that comes from being white, just that, the help that comes from being male, just that, the help that comes from the state intervening in a so-called free market, the help that comes from luck, just people that you meet along the way. Like, I think we've got to get better, all of us, at saying, hey, I had help, and so did you. And so, because if you craft a counter narrative that diminishes that tendency to look down on people who need help, which is what we do now, we look down on people in a very cruel and callous way who need assistance because we're convinced that we are not them. But we are them, and we've been them for a very long time. We just act like we did it all on our own, and they should too, when in fact none of us did it on our own. But if we're not countering that narrative, it becomes really easy to have disrespect for people on the bottom. Whereas if we're actually able to sort of come out of the closet, and I'm using that metaphor very deliberately, come out of the closet as the beneficiaries of unearned help, right? Whether it's from family, whether it's from our racial or gender identity, or whether it's from the hand of the government, whatever it might be, if we come out of the closet in that regard and own that, right, then it's going to be a lot harder over time for people to look down on others who need help because they'll know that their neighbor, who they thought was such a rugged individualist, also had help and that they themselves have had help. So I just want us to think in terms of, crafting better stories and better narratives that sort of upend the way that we normally think about these issues. And I think that would be true with regard to poverty. It's true with regard to prisons. It's true with regard to, any of the issues that we've been talking about here tonight. Thank you all so much again for being here. I appreciate it.